So, 2020 was a pretty big year for Apple. Multiple phones, a new iPad, and a whole new chipset for the Macs, which was crazy. Seriously, I cannot wait to get my hands on it just as soon as the 16GB version becomes properly available. Today though, we're going to be focusing on some phones, specifically the iPhone SE and the iPhone 12. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, on paper, the iPhone 12 is the significantly better phone. However, I want to dive a little bit deeper today and talk about it from a new perspective. Today, we're going to be talking about which phone offers the best value for your money from these two 2020 phones. So, without further ado, let's talk specs. Specs is certainly an area where these two phones differ greatly. For one, the iPhone SE features the last gen A13 Bionic processor, whereas the iPhone 12 featured that new A14 Bionic processor, which does give a nice little bump in performance. And of course, as usual, we're going to be talking more about that in its respective segment later on. The iPhone 12 also has 4GB of RAM, whereas the iPhone SE has 3GB. However, there was an area where they were the same. On both phones, you get a choice of either 64, 128, or 256GB of internal storage. No 512 on either of them, however, I don't care. What I meant to say is, I've never personally had a use for that larger storage variant. That said, it is nice to know that if you want to upgrade your onboard storage, say you keep a lot of apps on your phone, then it is nice to note that you have those higher storage options. In terms of color options, the iPhone 12 does have slightly more. You can get black, white, red, green, and blue versus the simple black, white, and red on the iPhone SE. Finally, for the key specs at least, we have the weight of each device. The iPhone 12 weighs in at 164 grams, whereas the iPhone SE weighs in at 148 grams, which is of course to be expected with that smaller size. However, I genuinely wasn't expecting the iPhone 12 to be that close, especially considering the size gap between these two phones. I was expecting the 12 to be significantly more heavy. I mean, guess not though. As for the key specs, that's pretty much it. If you're new to my videos, I tend not to focus too much on specs, and well, I will be covering other important specs later on, such as the screen resolution and the battery size. Those will, of course, be in their respective segments, and that's it for now. In terms of build quality, both of course feature that glass and aluminium build, but there are some key differences between these two phones. For one, the iPhone 12 does of course have that ceramic shield technology, meaning that it supposedly performs up to 4 times better in drop tests versus traditional glass. However, as always, they are both glass, so I personally would recommend a case on either. That said, throughout my personal testing of both of these phones, I decided to use them without a case, and both ended up just fine with no scratches or cracking, despite the couple of drops each suffered by accident. Both phones also feature an IP rating, the iPhone 12 receiving an IP68 rating, and this essentially means that it can survive in up to 6 meters of water for up to 30 minutes. The iPhone SE has the IP67 water resistance rating, which means it can survive in up to 1 meter of water for that same 30 minutes, and while this certainly isn't as impressive, I personally wouldn't recommend relying on either if you can avoid it. That said, I have definitely got both phones wet during my testing period, and both survived just fine. Okay, so overall, while the iPhone 12 does get a nice little bump in build quality, it is of course important to remember there is a significant price difference between these two phones, and as long as you're careful, both should be just fine. Next up, we're going to be focusing on the screen, and here we can see a definitive difference between these two phones. The iPhone 12 features a 6.1-inch Super Retina XDR OLED HDR10 certified display. That was a lot. It's also got a resolution of 1170 by 2532, whereas perhaps to save money, the iPhone SE elected to go with the 4.7-inch 750 by 1334 display. Being totally honest, there is a noticeable difference between the two, not just in size, but in overall sharpness and clarity, and colors just generally look richer on the iPhone 12, which is of course a feature of that OLED screen. That said, I actually know a lot of people who prefer the smaller screen, and up until the iPhone 12, I was certainly in that demographic myself. I found the iPhone XR and 11 far too big for my hand, so why the iPhone 12 when it shares that same screen size? Well, I actually do find the iPhone 12 to be slightly easier to hold in my hand than either of those phones. And well, to be totally honest, the SE does still feel more comfortable in my hands. The iPhone 12 is much easier to get used to than the previous 6.1-inch iPhones. Both phones are of course nice and bright with a typical brightness of 625 nits, but that being said, the iPhone 12, seeing as it is HDR10 certified, can reach up to a peak brightness of 1200 nits. During my testing, I found both to be totally fine, even on bright days, and honestly, you should have no problem with either. The technology that both these phones share, of course, is that True Tone display, and if you don't know what this is, it essentially means that if your lighting situation changes, the colors on your phone screen will stay balanced. Doesn't sound like a lot, but I'm glad that both of these phones have this frankly awesome feature. Both phones also feature haptic touch technology as the secondary interaction, and now obviously this is a nice have on any phone. It just makes opening up certain app features that extra little bit quick versus like opening up the app and then going through it, clicking on the wrong page, having to go back. It's just quicker to use haptic touch. Overall, I personally think it is quite clear that the iPhone 12 is the winner in this department. However, once again, it is important to remember that price difference between these two phones. So when choosing your personal winner, definitely bear that in mind. Me personally, the screen is a super important part of my phone experience, so I would be glad to pay the extra for the iPhone 12 here. Of course, a lot of this is preference, but I definitely think the screen is an area where Apple decided to save a little bit of money with the iPhone SE. After this, we have the button layout, which is actually very different on both. While the iPhone 12 has the notched iPhone button layout, the iPhone SE features that traditional button layout that we saw on phones like the iPhone 7 and 8. What this means is a 16:9 aspect ratio, no notch, and a home button, whereas on the iPhone 12, kind of the opposite. I know a lot of people who definitely prefer the home button and the 16:9 screen over the new design. And while I personally have adjusted nicely to that new design, again, very much personal preference here. After this, we have the Biometrics unlock system for each of these phones. And again, quite different here. The iPhone SE features that traditional Touch ID unlock method where you simply scan your finger and unlock your phone with the click of a home button, whereas the iPhone 12 uses that Face ID technology we first saw introduced on the iPhone 10. Honestly, both of these technologies are different, and again, it depends on your personal preference. However, these two phones are honestly the best in their category when it comes to biometrics. The Touch ID on the iPhone SE is snappy, accurate, and honestly, I've never had any issues with it. And on the iPhone 12, it's the same, but just for Face ID. Obviously, there are of course some advantages to Touch ID, like not having to look at your phone to unlock it, but I generally have come to prefer Face ID over the time I've been using these notched iPhones. But again, preference, and you can't really go wrong with either. Next up, we have another key area where, again, these phones significantly differ. In terms of specs, the iPhone SE features a single camera setup with a resolution of 12 megapixels and an aperture of f1.8, whereas the iPhone 12 features a dual camera setup, again with that same 12 megapixel wide angle. However, this time it has an aperture of f1.6, which essentially just means it's going to be slightly better in low light, and it also means it's going to be slightly easier to get a blurry background. It also features another 12 megapixel ultra wide camera with an aperture of f2.4, which is of course nice for getting those ultra wide, really nice and creative shots. In terms of quality, both phones have a really good amount of saturation and dynamic range, along with some really nice colors and a good level of sharpness, meaning that it's very easy to get a really nice image out of either. Of course, you can get more angles with the iPhone 12 because it has that ultra wide. Regardless though, I actually prefer using the wide angle because it does perform slightly better optically, and overall I'm very satisfied with the photo quality of both. In terms of other features though, the iPhone 12 does have night mode on all cameras, whereas the iPhone SE sadly doesn't, and this was actually one of my biggest complaints about this phone on release. Another area where these two phones do differ in camera performance is actually with the portrait mode. See, while both phones do actually have portrait mode, the iPhone SE is kinda limited. In fact, it only works on humans, which kinda sucks to be honest. With the portrait mode on the iPhone 12, it's not limited in any such way, and the edges actually do seem to be a little bit smoother rolling off into the background. And while you do still occasionally see a couple of jagged edges, it has been significantly improved from past generations. Oh yeah, there's also a front-facing camera on both. iPhone 12 has a 12 megapixel sensor, iPhone SE has a 7 megapixel sensor, both take nice selfies. That's pretty much it. I mean, what else can you really say about a front-facing camera? Moving on to video, again, we do see some significant differences here. While both offer some really nice dynamic range and 4K recording in up to 60 FPS, the iPhone 12 offers that Dolby Vision HDR technology that was introduced for the iPhone 12 line. And this looks absolutely stunning. The dynamic range that you can get when using this technology, amazing. And while it's only available in up to 30 FPS, I personally don't mind. Yeah, I think it looks awesome. The front-facing camera on the iPhone 12 is also a little better in terms of recording video, because again, you can record in 4K at up to 60 FPS, whereas with the iPhone SE, you can only record in 1080p at up to 30 FPS. Both phones feature slow motion. Again, it is slightly better on the iPhone 12. Realistically though, neither are ideal. They both look kind of mushy, but of course, you do get those slow fees with the iPhone 12, which, to be honest, I've only ever used in testing, but still, nice feature. Overall, while it is clear there is a pretty big difference between these two phones in terms of camera performance. To be honest, I think for the average user, the iPhone SE will be totally fine, and I don't think it's going to be worth the extra money for the average user. Again, for some casual snaps and selfies on days out, you really don't need the extra features of the iPhone 12. Alright, so following on from this, we have OS and app performance, which is a very important part of the smartphone experience, and I'm pleased to say on both, it is pretty fantastic. Because the iPhone SE has that A13 processor, scrolling through the OS, opening apps, and performing tasks like taking screenshots, all very snappy, and of course this is also the case with the iPhone 12, as again, it has that A14 processor, so the performance is going to be slightly better. Now, despite the fact that both were released in 2020, my money is on the iPhone 12 lasting that little bit longer in terms of life cycle. I mean, as I said, it has that newer processor, it has an extra gigabyte of RAM, and again, it did launch with iOS 14. That said, the iPhone 6S is still updated, and chances are both are going to get a really nice support cycle. In terms of slightly more intensive tasks like gaming or streaming high quality video, I have personally enjoyed, keyword enjoyed, the iPhone 12 slightly more. Now, I do think most of this is down to the better screen, as both have performed very well, but because of that better processor and more RAM, I also think with the more intensive tasks, chances are, again, the iPhone 12 is going to last that little bit longer. So, if you want to keep your phone for years and you're a power user, the iPhone 12 is definitely worth considering. That said, just about everything I tried the SE with, it performed absolutely great, it gave me no issues, and as I said, in terms of value, the iPhone SE is pretty phenomenal here. After this, we're talking speakers. Now, these are actually pretty similar in the way that they're both going to be totally fine for some casual listening, but I would recommend better headphones or speakers if you want accuracy or clarity. I found the iPhone 12 to seem a little louder as well as a bit more full sounding. However, both do feature that stereo technology that was introduced on the iPhone 7, and on both, it works great. It sounds nice and full on both, it's well balanced so you don't get one speaker louder than the other. So again, while the iPhone 12 does slightly pull ahead in this department, I really can't justify it for the price. So finally, and appropriately last, we have the battery life. The iPhone 12 features a 2,815 mAh battery, whereas the iPhone SE features a 1,820 mAh battery. So slight difference there, and while I certainly don't think the iPhone 12 was an improvement from the iPhone 11 on the battery life front, in fact, I'd say it actually got a little bit worse, I have found the iPhone 12 to be better than the iPhone SE in terms of battery life. That said, both do get me through my day totally fine, and once again, the difference isn't that much that I wouldn't recommend the iPhone SE, but yeah, there is a definite win for the iPhone 12 here. Alright, so, all things considered, which of these phones is the better value in 2020? I'm gonna say, for most people, I personally think the iPhone SE takes the win here. I mean, you get into the iOS ecosystem for around $400, and while you're not going to be getting any crazy new features, what you will get is a rock solid phone that will last for years and will definitely get the job done well for most people. That said, I think for people who really enjoy tech and see the value in things like a better screen, better camera, and that new design, the iPhone 12 is definitely worth the extra money. I mean, I certainly think it is. So yeah, depends on what you need. Alright guys, so that's it for today. Let me know which of these two phones you guys prefer with a comment. I always like reading your comments. As for now though, as always, thank you for watching. Remember to like the video if you want to see more content like this, then smash that subscribe button. I'm done for now, and I will see you guys in the next one.